Hello, salam, and welcome to my channel, What the Patriarchy, where we are working to dismantle the patriarchy, one Muslim feminist issue at a time, patriarchy and all other forms of injustices. Inshallah. Thank you so much for being here. I hope that you're all peaceful and well. This is Shahnaz Haqqani. So I keep being asked to do this video on polygamy. So here I am. I'm going to make a case in this video that the Qur'anic verses on polygamy, when read together, actually, in fact, prohibit polygamy rather than permitting it. It's just not an explicit prohibition. And the permission does not apply to just any man, and the attention to the context of orphans is actually quite crucial to what the text seems to be saying. And I'll be using the word polygamy in this video a lot. So polygamy is a general term that refers to the practice of marrying or having multiple spouses of any gender. Polygyny, and I've also heard it pronounced polygyny, but polygyny is the practice of having multiple wives, and polyandry is a form of polygamy. That's the practice of having multiple husbands. So polygamy can be for any gender, and then polygyny and polyandry are specific. I will be analyzing the Qur'anic verses in this video that are related to polygamy, but before that, I want to get a few things straight. So first, yes, Muhammad had 9 wives, but he also had one wife at one point, Khadija, to whom he was married exclusively the whole time that they were married, by which I mean that he didn't marry other women while he was married to her. That's kind of a big deal that I think a lot of people miss. I'm not an apologist for polygamy. You'll see my opinion showing up in this video later on. Layla Ahmad has a really insightful argument that she makes for what it means that Muhammad's polygyny came only after Khadija's death and after Islam, not before Islam. You can read about it in her book. I believe it's in the book Women and Gender in Islam, which I have already done an episode on in this channel that I've summarized. The second thing that I want you to know before we get to analyzing the text is, did you know that while Ali, Muhammad's cousin and companion and son-in-law, was married to Fatima, Ali kept begging the Prophet Muhammad to let him marry another wife. But Muhammad consistently forbade him from doing so. So if Muhammad didn't think that even Ali couldn't do polygyny right, if even Ali couldn't do polygamy right while married to his daughter Fatima, Muhammad's beloved daughter, who on earth do you think you are? Or who on earth do you think your husband is, or your father, or your son, or whoever? Who on earth do you think regular random Muslim men are to be doing polygamy right? And why doesn't that count as sunnah, as prophetic practice, where Muhammad forbade Ali from marrying another wife while he was married to Fatima? Why does no one try to emulate that teaching of the Prophet Muhammad when he prohibited Ali from having another wife while married to Fatima? And by the way, and this is really sad, when Fatima died, Ali went ahead and got married within 5 days of her death. I have very strong opinions about this because women are expected to wait for 3 menstrual cycles or 3 months before they can remarry. And here Ali married literally 5 days, within 5 days after Fatima's death. That's how desperate he was to remarry. This is why I keep saying death to patriarchy. And this is why this channel exists. The point is, Ali wanted to marry another woman while he was married to Fatima, Muhammad's daughter. Muhammad forbade him from doing so. And the reason he was not allowing him to do so was because he knew polygamy was not right. And if Muhammad didn't think Ali could do polygamy right, who does anyone think they are to be doing it right, to be entitled to doing so? The third point I want to make before I get to the analysis of the text is, when it comes to justifying polygamy, many people think that it makes sense to say that if the woman can't have kids, if the wife can't have children, then her husband can take other wives because he wants to have kids. But we have to ask here, what happens if the husband can't have kids? Can the woman then have multiple husbands or marry another woman while married to this husband who can't have kids because they want to have kids? If not, do you see the contradiction here / the hypocrisy here, the double standard here? If your answer is yes to both, then we don't have a problem. The fourth point I want to make before I get to the analysis of the text is the whole consent thing is actually really essential here in the Quranic text. Fiqh, which is traditional patriarchal Islam, does not consider the consent of the existing wife or current wife or wives essential for the man to marry another wife. And actually, even the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ himself did not seek the consent of his current or existing wives before he married new ones, which means it's not even sunnah to get the consent of your existing wives to marry someone else. But the fact of the matter is that the Quranic verses on polygamy, on marriage, on divorce, on sex, etc., they do take consent to be quite a big deal, and in fact even essential, because those verses focus very much on equality and on equity and justice. And the Quranic verses on polygyny also prohibit preferential treatment of one wife over another. So consent is kind of a big deal. And again, I'll get to those in just a bit. You can't possibly have multiple wives, hide from one wife the fact that you're married to another woman as well, just because she won't approve, and think that you're doing something that is ethically acceptable, that is Islamically acceptable, that is Qur'anically acceptable, that is divinely acceptable, because you're not. Qur'anic verse number 5, chapter 5, verse number 5, speaks about not having secret wives. Speaking of which, have you ever thought about how convenient it is that patriarchal Islam does not apply Qur'anic verse 5, the verse where having secret spouses is forbidden? Traditional Islam does not interpret or apply 5 to mean that men absolutely cannot have secret wives somehow. But think about how common secret marriages are, especially for religious leaders. It was a whole trend a few years ago. It still is. Okay. The fifth point that I want to make is that if you think that a man can have multiple sex partners, multiple wives, because he has a high sex drive, you should probably read up on female sexuality and male sexuality some more, and on the fact that the Islamic tradition is actually historically believed, the Islamic tradition outside of fiqh believed that the female sex drive is so much more stronger than the male sex drive. That is why, fun fact, the woman has to be covered up from head to toe. That is why she must be kept hidden from the rest of society, from men that she's not related to. That is why she must be staying at home and not leave the house, and so on. Also, if your wife or your female partner doesn't like to have sex, or you think women don't like to have much sex with you, that your sex drive is stronger than someone else, than the women in your family, in your life, your wife, your partner, etc., most likely what's happening is you're just selfish in bed. You're probably not exciting for her sexually. You're probably not satisfying her sexually, and so she doesn't look forward to having sex with you. That doesn't mean women don't like sex. That means your partner doesn't like sex because you are most likely doing something wrong. But if you make a good effort to satisfy her, you might find out that women like more sex than you. Okay, women look forward to sex, and they love sex when they're being sexually fulfilled. It's a huge mystery. I know, who would have thunk? Gosh, women, right? Also, have you ever noticed how no one tells men to be patient when they're struggling in a marriage with their wife, but everyone tells women to have sabr, to be patient, to persevere when the husband is even being abusive? If he wants another wife, people tell this woman to not be jealous, to just be patient, to change, to do something, to cook for him more, to be more sexually available, etc., etc. But have you noticed how we rationalize men's jealousy? How we validate it, how we affirm it? Right? A man's jealousy is treated as such an essential and inherent, fundamental, masculine, male, inherently masculine quality, such an acceptable thing in society, that we literally forbid women from even talking to other men because, hey, the husband might get jealous. That's what we tell women. I've been told that, and a lot of women I know have been told that. Young girls are being told that constantly. Why is female jealousy not honored similarly? This is why you got to start paying attention to the double standards and the harmful ways that patriarchy ignores women's emotions and feelings and experiences. Men's jealousy becomes a legitimate excuse to cause women so much harm, but women's jealousy is mocked and ridiculed, and we're dismissed as being irrational and crazy and, jealous. So the point is polygamy because, women can't have polygamy because then the husband might get jealous, doesn't make any sense. The sixth point that I want to make, and this is a fun fact, the Qur'an never actually prohibits polyandry. which is women having multiple husbands. There's one verse in the Qur'an, chapter 4, verse number 24, that some people think prohibits polyandry, but they're wrong. The word that is used there, muhsanat, which is like a key term there, married women, doesn't consistently in the Quran mean married women. And all Quranic commentators don't agree that it means married women. Right? It's more complicated. We'll have to talk about 424 at a different point. But why does the Quran not prohibit polygamy for women, so polyandry? Because, like most Muslims will tell us, the Quran is for all times and all places, and there may come a time or a context or some kind of a need where a woman needs to have a multiple husbands to fill some societal gap, some societal need. I don't know. God works in mysterious ways, and we can't question God's wisdom, So don't forget something that God has not forbidden, is what I'm saying. The seventh point I want to make before I get to the analysis of the text is that there are communities in the world where women themselves want polygamy because there's some social or socio-political issue that requires having polygamy for a man to have multiple spouses. In the US, for example, Dr. Deborah Majid, who just passed away a few years ago, may she rest in peace, her research on polygamy shows that some African American communities in the United States, they endorse polygamy and see it as fulfilling the Quranic idea of polygamy because, and this is really, really interesting and very important, the Quran and Islam generally approve of polygamy in context of war and conflict, a context that leads to some reduction in male providers. And African Americans have a long, violent history of conflict in the US, such that white supremacy continues to separate the black family, break the black family apart, and make sure that black families do not thrive, or preferably for white supremacy, not even survive, don't have children, don't have access to their children, and so on. And so black Muslims in the US see polygamy as a form of resistance to white supremacy. In other contexts like Bosnia, after the war in the 90s, many Bosnian women themselves supported polygamy because the number of Bosnian men killed in the war called for men to have multiple wives, multiple spouses, to accommodate this new societal gap. It's patriarchy still, to be sure. It's still patriarchy that allows for men to do this. But the point is that there's no one opinion on how and why to do polygamy. All of that is legitimate, but it has me asking, if polygamy can be a legitimate response to a lack of men in the community, can polyandry be a legitimate response to the lack of women in a community? I remember asking my Qur'an teacher this several years ago, decades ago, at the mosque. And I gave her the example of China, where the number of women is much lower, at least at the time that was. I haven't kept up with the statistics now. But the number of women in China is much lower because of the historical one-child policy and the rejection or the disposal of daughters, sometimes even the murder of daughters, if a daughter was born because the family wanted a son. So I asked my teacher, in that context, where China then has fewer girls than boys, fewer women than men, can women then have multiple husbands because the societal gap, right? And her response, no, because it's China's fault for creating this situation. It should never have happened. It should never have had this policy in the first place. And I'm like, all question marks. Because what even, why don't we say the same thing? Why don't we say it's the fault of society, of people, of men who start wars, when just because we have fewer men, because men had to fight in a war, and so now we have fewer men, and to fill this gap, they got to marry more women. Why doesn't anybody say the war should never have taken place in the first place? It just doesn't make sense why the war is somehow a legitimate context, but which is a very political thing, but the one-child policy is not legitimate reason for polygamy then. The point isn't about who started the war. The point isn't who started the problem. The point is, what is the reality? How can we minimize harm? That's one of the most essential points of Islam and of Islamic law. How can we deal with the reality at hand, so that the problem doesn't persist or doesn't worsen? You see, this is why patriarchy never makes any sense. And if you try to make sense of it, your head will break and your brains will fall out of your head. And I hear that's not good. So now let's finally talk about the Quranic verses. The relevant verses in question are Quranic verse 4:3, chapter 4, verse number 3, and chapter 4, verse number 129, 4:129. I will share them here with the neighboring verses for context. Quranic verse 4:1 says, O humankind, fear your sustainer, your Rabb, who created you from one soul and created from this soul its mate and dispersed from both of them many men and women. And reverence God through whom you ask one another and reverence the wombs. Verse 4:2 says, and give to the orphans their properties and do not substitute the defective of your own, presumably, for the good of theirs, presumably. And do not consume their properties into your own. That's a great sin. 4:3 says, and if you fear that you will not deal justly with the orphan girls, then marry those that please you of other women, 2 or 3 or 4. But if you fear that you will not be just, then only one or those whom your right hand possesses. That's people you enslave. So note that 4:3 is a continuation of 4:2, which was just warning us against exploiting the vulnerable, in this case, orphan children. It specifies orphans. The point in 4:3 to me is very clear. Don't be marrying vulnerable people whom you are in a position of power over because you have the ability to exploit them by doing so. You might steal their wealth. You're not allowed to do that. You might harm them in some way. You're not allowed to do that. They have no agent to protect them from you, from your harm and exploitation, and they deserve justice. They deserve safety and security. So don't marry the orphan girls, but instead marry other women, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Right? The key point being, don't marry orphan girls. The reason you don't marry them is because you might harm them. But notice also that Quranic verse 4:3 has a very, very important qualifier / condition. If you fear that you will not be able to deal justly with the orphan girls, then don't marry them, right? Marry instead other women that please you. You can marry up to 4 of them. But if you fear that you will not be just to multiple women, then only one. Or marry those whom your right hand possesses, which is euphemism for slavery. So the condition here is really, really important, and it needs to be highlighted more. If you know that you cannot treat them equally and justly, then you only get to marry one. And there's going to be a catch here. The catch is coming up. God will tell us you can never treat multiple wives justly, no matter how hard you try. For some reason, I always thought, and I think a lot of people think, that polygamy was only acceptable when it came to supporting orphans or marrying orphans and widows. But after a close reading of Quranic verse 4:3, I have no idea what to think anymore. It's not saying marry them, it's saying don't marry them if you know that you will be unjust or unkind to them and abuse them and exploit them. If you might harm them, don't marry them. Now let's talk about who the you in this verse is. Is it just any man? All men? All male readers of the Quran? Or those men, or non-men too, who are entrusted as guardians of orphans? I'm absolutely not convinced that it's just any man here. It's not. To me, it seems very clear that it's a very specific man, and it's the man who is in a position of power over the orphan person. There's a concept called the paterfamilias that Karen Bauer and Firas Hamza discuss in a recent book of theirs called Women, Households, and the Hereafter in the Quran, a Patronage of Piety. Highly recommended, an amazing, amazing book. They talk a lot about this concept of the paterfamilias, the head of the household, and the socio-historical context in which that individual is really important, and the role that they play is really important. So essentially, the polygamy business here is only for the paterfamilias. The other relevant verse in the Quran on polygamy is 4:129, chapter 4, verse number 129. So let's take a look at the neighboring verses and the verses before it. 4:127 says, "They ask you, O Prophet, regarding women. Say, it is God who instructs you regarding them. Instruction has been revealed in the book concerning the orphan women whom you deprive of their due rights but still wish to marry. Also helpless children, as well as standing up for orphans' rights. And whatever good you do is certainly well known to God." 128 says, "If a woman fears indifference or neglect, The Arabic word here is nushuz, from her husband. There is no blame on either of them if they seek settlement, which is best. Humans are ever inclined to selfishness. 129 says, you will never be able to maintain justice between your wives, no matter how keen you are, no matter how hard you try. So do not totally incline towards one, leaving the other in suspense. And if you do what is right and are mindful, surely God is all forgiving, most merciful. Conveniently, the Arabic word adl in 129 is too often translated as emotionally just. So 129 that I read was, you will never be able to maintain adl, justice between your wives, and it gets translated in most translations as emotionally unjust, when it simply means justice. And that tells us something about the commentators and the translators of the Quran. They recognized a possible discrepancy when reading the polygamy verses collectively. And this is their way of correcting that discrepancy. This is a common thing that happens in all interpretations of all religious texts. What is the discrepancy, you ask? One verse seems to allow men to marry multiple, so not just any man though, right? The paterfamilias. One verse allows men to marry multiple wives, 1, 2, 3, 4, on the very clear condition that he treat them all equally. But then another verse says, haha, gotcha. You can't treat your multiple wives equally, no matter how hard you try. The verses on polygamy literally require men to be completely equal to all of their wives. What is equality? The problem, sort of, is that we get to decide what equality means here. And the Quran itself also recognizes that you are inherently incapable, that we as humans are inherently incapable of doing this. So when we read these two verses together, and all of these verses really, when we read them together, what do we get? Polygamy done in accordance with the Quran, with the Quranic stipulations, is simply not possible. When we read these two verses together, the logical conclusion should be that polygamy is not acceptable Quranically. But when you've got only men interpreting the word of God, the Quran, and claiming monopoly over the word of God, like in all religious traditions, to be very, very clear, you end up with Muslim men saying that by equality, what God really meant was equality in finances. If you're going to get one of them a house, you got to get the other one a house too. You're going to buy one a gift, you buy the other a gift as well. Or we get stuff like it's equality in feelings or emotions. But also, what does that even mean? It's not possible for humans to desire, sexually desire, or physically or emotionally desire two people in the same way, like equally to the same extent. What a frustrating loophole, right? And this loophole somehow, like all other loopholes, benefit men and they harm women. Patriarchy physically gives me a headache, and this is a part of why. These loopholes, they exist and they justify harm and oppression and injustices. And who do they harm? People who have not had the luxury to contribute to this discussion for the past 1400 years. Except, is it really a loophole when this interpretation goes against what the Quran is telling us? Like literally, you gotta treat them equally. And you can't treat them equally. That's just not how you're designed as a human. You see, most men who have multiple wives marry the second wife or the third or the fourth or whatever because they fell in love with her or because they got bored of the first one, which is disgusting and horrible. So from the get-go, they're already defying the Quranic stipulation here, which is you're incapable of feeling the same thing for two people, and that's not allowed, because if that's going to be the case, then you can't have polygamy. You're not just. Even if we go by the standard of most commentators here, all of whom agree you got to treat all the women equally, even if we go by the emotional equality business, the fact that so many men who are polygamous marry the second or the third or the fourth wife because they are attracted to her or because they have some kind of a desire for her is inherently setting him up for injustice, for causing harm to the existing wife or wives. But too many Muslims and too many men read these multiple Quranic verses about justice and treating people equally, etc., and being careful in polygamy as mere recommendations to men, not as obligations. being just, being fair, being kind, being good is only an obligation conveniently when the woman has to do it. I've done a separate episode on this pattern that I have seen in pretty much all religious traditions. Guidelines to women are always treated as requirements. They're obligations that come with penalties, social or religious or legal and so on. But guidelines to men, they're mere recommendations. And this pattern needs to die. Back to polygamy now. In addition to the Qur'anic idea of polygyny, there are hadiths like a man who marries multiple wives and does not treat them all equally will arrive on the day of judgment with half of his body paralyzed. Why does no one enforce this idea more? Why is it all me in patriarchal Islam, men being obsessed with taking what they think are their rights, what they think they're entitled to, when, if you think about it, these are actually the rights of marginalized people. People whose rights can be denied to them if their caretakers aren't good people, which is exactly what the Quran is highlighting here. Don't marry the orphan because you are likely to exploit her. But since we're humans and we like to pick and choose and we have no concept of consistency and we only like to take parts of the scripture that benefit us, that work for us, right? Even if they harm someone else, unfortunately, we've got a history of 1,400 years of scholarly and personal commentaries of the Quran permitting polygamy like it's no one's business. We have to ask, what is this connection between orphans and polygamy and justice? Traditional historical Islam or traditional historical commentators of Islam say that the connection is that if you have orphans under your guardianship and you don't think you can be just to them if you marry them, then marry other women up to 4, presumably non-orphans who are not under your care. So if you're not a guardian of orphans, then you can't marry multiple wives? Because that's what I think. And none of the commentators conclude this. But it's still unclear, right, what this connection is. If you can't be just to orphans, if you can't be just to these orphans that you might exploit if you marry them, then marry other women, marry up to 4 wives that are not orphans. And this is the power of interpretation. Pay attention always to what our options are when we're reading the Quran and whether we're taking the best possible, the most ethically possible meaning or interpretation of the text, or are we taking the interpretation that only serves the patriarchy? Because too often it's the latter. Quranic verse 39:55, chapter 39, verse number 55, urges us to extract from the book of God, from the Quran, the best possible meaning in every verse. So if we have options to read the polygamy verses in a way that will reduce harm to humanity, why the hell have we not done so yet? But see, this is exactly what I mean. The patriarchy will always interpret the Quran in a way that benefits men and harms women. But I will say this, I am so deeply grateful and I so deeply appreciate that for the past exegetes, for the past scholars of the Quran, interpreters of the Quran, the focus on polygamy, on the polygyny verses in like verse 4:3 was justice. They recognized that the Quran was trying very hard to implement justice and to remove harm. And harm against whom? Harm against vulnerable people, like orphans under the care of potentially exploitative male guardians. Dr. Hadia Mubarak has a whole book on this in which she talks about this point of justice in Muslim scholars' commentaries, and I've interviewed her about her book. And you can watch it on my YouTube channel, and you can also listen to it in audio form on the podcast New Books in Islamic Studies. Besides, most rational and moral humans today should, I want to say, or they do understand that when you're a legal guardian to someone like an orphan child, someone that you have to take care of, you don't marry them anyway. First, you don't marry children, right? And second, you don't marry somebody that you have any power over, that you can abuse, like someone under your supervision. I know that blows the minds of people who think that men are supposed to have control and authority over their wives, which means that, oh crap, You just married somebody that you have control over, that you have power over. That's a you problem you got to figure out. That's not a me problem, so I'm not going to talk about it here. But my friend Adnan Majid has a really great interpretation that I think makes a lot of sense. If you have orphans under your care, and you know that you can't be just to them if you married them, then instead of marrying the orphan, you can marry their mothers. This is important because orphan historically, like in this context, and in many South Asian cultures today, like my parents' culture, the word orphan means someone whose father or sole financial provider has died or is not available. So it's not literally orphans in the sense of an orphan child who doesn't have parents or a father. It's anybody who is financially deprived or who is already exploited socially, or somebody who does not have their financial provider. And if one is saying that they're marrying an orphan or a widow or some other vulnerable member of society as a service to them, as a benefit to the vulnerable, I have a few things to say about this. First, I disagree with this. I think that you can still support somebody, take care of them, financially and otherwise, without marrying them. But historically, and even today in many, many societies like my parents' community in Pakistan, where I was born, the institution of marriage works so dramatically different than the way that it does in many, many, many other parts of the world, like in the US, where I currently live, as does the treatment of orphans. Often in villages and other rural parts of many countries around the world, like in Pakistan, when someone's parents die, the law doesn't necessarily have to officially get involved, but the community gets involved. The community might take over the child's welfare, like the child's relatives. In those communities, a woman is considered worthless, completely worthless, and is supposed to be pitied and is considered and actually is treated as quite vulnerable. She actually is quite vulnerable to harm and injustices from other people, but especially from the people who have just taken over responsibilities of her. And it's usually the men in her life, like her brothers-in-law or even brothers and uncles, that are the ones causing harm. And so a kind man in the community, right, in the local community, might marry her to show mercy on her as a form of service to humanity. You see, in many parts of the world, women aren't allowed to live independently. You can't just live on your own. You can't just rent a house or buy a house on your own without the approval of or signature of some man in your life. But regardless of, even if you get their approval, it's socially not a thing. It is not accepted. It's not acceptable. It's not just frowned upon. There's no infrastructure that would allow that. I know way too many women, like in Pakistan, who are actually financially independent, right? In that they have well-paying jobs, they have a great education, but they still can't divorce their husbands, or are told they can't divorce their husbands because they're considered then to be a burden on their parents, to whose house they will go back in case a divorce happens or their marriage doesn't work out, or to their brothers. The social structures simply do not allow for a divorced woman or an orphan child, a female orphan, to grow up in a way where she can just thrive independently. That way, a man is doing her a favor by marrying her. But make no mistake, this idea needs to die still. We need to set in place better conditions. We need to empower women so that they don't need to depend on men. We need to teach women not to see their value in marriage and in kids only. We need to create communities and to offer resources where women can be independent, right, financially and otherwise, and say maybe live with at least each other, so that they don't have to be considered a burden on their brothers and their fathers and their sisters-in-law or whoever else, on their families, just because they're not married. In communities like these, abolishing polygamy is a very, very futile, very unproductive task. It's even irrelevant. It's an irrelevant goal because the circumstances, right? The circumstances are the ones that need to change first. We need to change the circumstances that enable and facilitate polygamy in a very, very, very harmful way. Healthy societies and societies that are safe for women, they don't see or treat women as a burden or some kind of a burden on society or on their families. Healthy and prosperous societies promote and support the independence of women, facilitate women's independence, and they work towards the reduction of dependency. But they treat every member of society as a valuable asset, okay, regardless of their potential, regardless of their position, regardless of their conditions and circumstances. Healthy and prosperous societies, the societies that I would love to see more of in the world or see them in the world, they don't see marriage as more beneficial to women than to men. And they also don't see marriage as a privilege for vulnerable women. I don't know if such societies exist because patriarchy is a global pandemic, but I do know that patriarchy is less severe in some places than it is in other places. I know that women are not viewed as a burden on their family in every society. Which brings me to ask parents, why on earth would you want your child, your daughter, to be dependent on someone else? Why would you not teach and inspire your daughter to be educated and at least know how to find a job so that she doesn't have to depend on someone else financially? Which is the most common reason, by the way, that women stay in abusive, in unsafe marriages, because they're dependent on their husbands financially. This is in societies that claim they have no patriarchy, like the United States. How does it help your daughter to be dependent on someone else? Do you not love her? And I know that sounds simplistic of me to say, to reduce it to do you love her, do you not love her? Or to do you not want good for her? Because if you loved her, if you cared for her, to the point where you don't want her to be dependent on someone else, why not invest in her education and independence? I recognize that it's a privilege to be able to invest in somebody's education. I get that. Even rich families, I know a lot of Pakistani rich families that do not want their daughters to be educated beyond a certain point because they expect her to marry a rich man who will provide for her for the rest of her life. Why do you love the patriarchy so much more than your own daughter? It's one thing, I think, to hope for a good husband for her, for a good spouse for her if she's heterosexual, who will gladly provide for her by his own choice and who will gladly take care of her financially and otherwise. But it's something completely different to expect that from whoever she marries and then make entire whole decisions about your daughter's life based on those expectations, regardless of what happens to her in reality. All of that to say that it makes sense to me that some Muslims casually believe that polygamy is permitted in Islam only if the man is marrying a vulnerable member of society, like a widow or an orphan or a woman who has no one else to support her financially. Marriage in that context becomes a security measure for the woman. It's just, can we work towards eradicating those particular situations? But overall, my personal position on polygamy is that it causes more harm than good. And the Qur'an and Islamic law, Sharia, generally tend to forbid things that cause more harm than good. So if we could abolish polygamy maybe yesterday or just real soon, I would really, really, really appreciate that. Now, to be sure, I'm talking about exploitative polygyny, not just polygamy in general, because more and more couples are entering polyamorous and open relationships today, which are polygamous relationships, right? And these aren't what I think need to be abolished. Because in theory, this is to be very, very clear, in theory, these are ethical in that everyone's consent is required and involved. And the rules apply to all genders involved, right? The option isn't just for men only. Polyamory is not an exclusively male privilege, but polygyny is unfortunately an exclusively male privilege. What I strongly believe needs to be abolished are those things, practices, actions that only men are legally and socially permitted to do so, and that actually cause harm, more harm than good, and that exploit women and become socially justifiable reasons for maintaining injustices like patriarchal practices of polygamy. Practically and realistically speaking, how many marriages do we know that are both polygamous and ethical and just, fair, compassionate, ethical in accordance with Islam, with the Qur'an? Probably none. But I don't know all the polygamous men out there of the world, and so I can't really speak to all of them. And if you're wondering how that's possible, can we really forbid something that Allah has permitted? Then, I mean, were you not paying attention to like everything I was just saying? But also, we abolished slavery when God apparently permitted it. You see, we have options. We have options, and we will always have options. We do have permission from God to change things that cause us harm collectively as a society, as people. And we are required, not just recommended, but we are required to pursue justice and to act in just and compassionate and kind and fair ways at all times, even if it is against ourselves, our own selves, against our families, against our kith and kin. And so here, maybe you want to be a polygamous person, but if you can't be just, and you know you can't be just because God herself, your creator, told you that you can't possibly have multiple wives and be just to all of them, then you got to fight against your own nafs, your own self, so that justice can prevail. It's very simple. It's very, very simple. Don't be selfish. Don't be arrogant. Don't be unkind. Don't be unjust, because God doesn't like the unjust. God doesn't like injustice. And we have the fact here that one of the major objectives of the Sharia is exactly to remove harm, to reduce harm. We have tools in Islamic law, something called maslahah, for example, which refers to the common good, the collective good, the public good, the welfare of society. And ijtihad is another tool, just the idea of reinterpreting something that was previously interpreted one particular way, and just generally the concept of the reduction of harm that we can use as justifications, as Islamic justifications. Some of these are Qur'anic justifications for removing any unjust practices of like polygamy. And there are several Muslim scholars themselves, including some famous ones that you probably trust already, like Ibn Ashur, right, or Muhammad Abduhu, who say the same thing, that polygamy as it is practiced in reality causes harm. It causes more harm than good, to the point that it needs to be illegalized everywhere. Okay, so I'm gonna have to stop here because I gotta go live. I hope that you're all peaceful and that you'll continue being peaceful. Thanks so much for watching. Again, this is Shahnaz, and I'll see you guys for the next video. Salam.